Forget everything you knew about William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. His real last words before execution had nothing in common with the heroic cry of freedom. They were far more terrifying and exposed all the horror of medieval justice. On August 23, 1305, crowds of Londoners gathered at Smithfield Square not to witness a heroic death. They came to watch the public humiliation and agonizing execution of a man whom the English crown had declared a traitor. But what exactly Wallace uttered in his final minutes makes modern historians shudder with horror. The story of William Wallace is not a romantic tale of the struggle for independence, but a bloody drama of medieval politics, where victors wrote history and the defeated faced a fate worse than death. After his defeat at Falkirk in 1298, Wallace transformed from a military commander into a partisan, hiding in Scotland's forests and swamps. For 7 years he evaded English traps, but in 1305 he was betrayed by his own ally, Sir John Menteith. The betrayal happened near Glasgow, when Wallace was meeting with allies to plan new operations against the English. Menteith, who had received promises of land and gold from King Edward, lured Wallace into an ambush. The Scottish patriot was captured while sleeping, a humiliating end for a man who once struck terror into English garrisons across the border. The journey from his capture site to London took several weeks. Wallace was transported in iron shackles, displayed through towns like a trophy. English chroniclers of the time describe how crowds gathered to see the Scottish devil, hurling stones and rotten vegetables at the cart. Edward I wanted the entire world to see. This is what happens to those who dare challenge the English crown. In London, Wallace faced not an ordinary trial, but a theatrical performance. The charges were formulated in advance: high treason, murder of civilians, sacrilege, and robbery. The judges read the verdict to a man who, under English law, had never been an English subject, an absurdity that Wallace tried to turn to his advantage. Right here, in Westminster's courtroom, Wallace spoke words that would echo through the centuries. When the judge accused him of treason against the crown, the Scotsman replied, "I cannot be a traitor to Edward, since I was never his subject." This phrase contained a legal challenge to the entire system of English dominance over Scotland, but the judges ignored its logic. Medieval executions were not simply methods of taking life. They represented complex rituals of power, designed to demonstrate the divine right of monarchs to punish and pardon. Execution by hanging, drawing, and quartering was considered the most shameful form of capital punishment, reserved exclusively for traitors. Each element of this procedure carried symbolic meaning. Dragging through the streets meant public humiliation. Partial hanging symbolized the condemned's suffering, and quartering was meant to deny the body the possibility of resurrection on Judgment Day. Preparation for Wallace's execution became a state event. King Edward personally controlled the details, demanding that the procedure be carried out with maximum cruelty, yet stretched over time. The executioners received special instructions. Wallace must remain conscious as long as possible to feel every moment of his suffering. On August 23rd, at dawn, Wallace was tied to horses' tails and dragged through London's streets from the Tower to Smithfield. 4 miles over cobblestones, mud, and filth. A journey meant to finally break the Scotsman's spirit. But even bleeding and covered in wounds, Wallace did not beg for mercy or plead for a quick death. On Smithfield's scaffold, Wallace came face to face with an executioner who had practiced the art of slow killing for many years. But what happened next shocked even the hardened spectators of medieval London. The Scotsman began to speak, and his words proved more terrifying than any cries of pain. When the noose was placed around his neck, Wallace did not utter the traditional prayer for forgiveness of sins. Instead, he began methodically cursing everyone who had participated in his capture and trial. English chroniclers recorded only fragments of his speech, but even these fragments paint a picture far from Hollywood heroism. "May England's soil be soaked with the blood of your children." These words, according to the Lanercost Chronicle, Wallace spoke while looking directly into the eyes of the judges who came to watch his execution. He did not ask God for the salvation of his soul. He prayed for revenge against his enemies. For a medieval Christian, this was tantamount to cursing his own soul. Modern historians have long debated the authenticity of these records. Professor Duncan Brown from the University of Glasgow, in his study Last Words of Medieval Martyrs, notes that English chroniclers had every reason to distort Wallace's final words to present him not as a martyr, but as an embittered fanatic. However, independent Scottish sources confirm the general tone of his deathbed speech. These were not words of forgiveness, but words of hatred. The noose tightened, but the executioners did not let Wallace die from strangulation. After several minutes, they took him down from the gallows, still alive, and laid him on a wooden table for the next stage of execution. It was at this moment, when the executioner's knife touched his stomach, that Wallace spoke a phrase that made even the most hard-hearted spectators shudder. "My blood will become the seed from which 1,000 avengers will grow." These words, recorded by a Franciscan monk present at the execution, resembled more a pagan incantation than a Christian prayer. Wallace spoke not of forgiveness or meeting God. He spoke of an endless chain of violence that would consume his enemies. Psychologists studying human behavior in extreme situations find in Wallace's words classic signs of what specialists call traumatic dissociation. Faced with inevitable agonizing death, his consciousness disconnected from physical reality and focused on the only thing that still mattered to him: hatred for his enemies. Dr. Sarah Gilbert from King's College London, a specialist in medieval psychology, explains, Wallace was in a state that modern science calls adrenaline psychosis. The body, protecting itself from unbearable pain, blocks normal emotional reactions. In this state, a person can focus only on the most primitive instincts: survival and revenge. Witnesses to the execution noted that Wallace did not scream in pain when the executioner began opening his stomach. Instead, he continued speaking, and his voice became louder and clearer. He listed the names of English lords who participated in Scotland's conquest, wishing each a specific, elaborate death. "To Longshanks I wish to die in his own excrement." This is how Wallace referred to King Edward, using his nickname. "To Comyn the traitor, I wish that his son's sons forget his name." For a medieval person, the curse of being forgotten by descendants was considered worse than physical death. It meant complete erasure of the soul from the world's memory. What particularly amazed witnesses was that Wallace pronounced these curses in 3 languages: Gaelic, Latin, and English. He seemed to want his words understood by everyone, from simple London craftsmen to educated clerics. This was not a spontaneous outburst of rage from a dying man, but a carefully thought-out speech that he had possibly rehearsed in his prison cell. Monk Thomas of Dunfermline, whose chronicle is considered one of the most accurate sources about Wallace's execution, recorded, "His words were like serpent's venom, and many in the crowd crossed themselves upon hearing them. For he spoke not as a Christian going to the Lord, but as a pagan calling upon dark spirits." When the executioner extracted Wallace's entrails from his stomach and showed them to the crowd, the Scotsman was still alive. And it was at this moment that he spoke his last, most terrible words. According to several independent sources, he said, "See, even my entrails are redder than English blood." This phrase so struck contemporaries with its cynicism that 3 chroniclers recorded it. The crowd at Smithfield came to witness the triumph of English justice over a Scottish rebel. But instead of a repentant Christian pleading to God for forgiveness, they saw a man who, even facing the most agonizing death, refused to acknowledge defeat. His last words were not a cry of pain, but an act of psychological resistance that frightened his enemies more than any military victory. After Wallace's death, his body was cut into pieces and hung at the 4 corners of the English kingdom, his head on London Bridge, right arm in Newcastle, left in Berwick, right leg in Perth, left in Stirling. But this display of power produced the opposite result. The Scotsman's last words began living their own life. Execution by hanging, drawing, and quartering was the cruelest form of capital punishment in medieval Europe, but few understand how complex and symbolic this procedure was. Each stage had specific legal and religious significance, turning murder into a ritual of state power. Dragging through the streets was meant to demonstrate the condemned's complete powerlessness. A man tied to horses' tails ceased being a person and became cargo that could be dragged through mud. English lawyers of the 14th century explained this element as returning the traitor to an animal state from which he should never have emerged. Partial hanging served 2 purposes. First, it was an imitation of ordinary execution for commoners. The noose reminded that a traitor was unworthy even of an honest death by hanging. Second, strangulation was meant to bring the condemned to a state between life and death, when the soul begins leaving the body but can still return. The most horrifying part was evisceration, extracting internal organs from a still living person. Edward I's executioners studied anatomy specifically for this procedure to maximize the condemned's agony. First the stomach was opened, then the intestines and stomach extracted, then the heart and lungs. Vital organs were saved for last. However, Wallace's case destroys many popular notions about medieval executions. The first myth is that the condemned always asked for forgiveness and prayed for their soul's salvation. Chronicles of that time are full of examples of people who met death with curses on their lips, but church scribes usually corrected their last words according to Christian canons. The second myth concerns crowd behavior. Modern films show medieval spectators as a bloodthirsty mass rejoicing in others' suffering. In reality, public executions often evoked people's sympathy for the condemned, especially if they demonstrated courage in the face of death. Wallace's case was an exception. His curses frightened even London's common folk. The third misconception relates to the effectiveness of such executions as a means of intimidation. King Edward calculated that Wallace's agonizing death would force the Scots to submit. The result was opposite. Within months of the execution, new uprisings began throughout Scotland under Robert the Bruce's leadership. The fourth myth concerns executioners' roles. In mass consciousness, they are portrayed as sadists taking pleasure in others' suffering. In reality, most medieval executioners were professionals who tried to perform their work as efficiently as possible. Many even secretly sympathized with victims and tried to hasten their death when authorities weren't watching. The political context of Wallace's execution helps understand why his last words so frightened the English elite. By 1305, Edward I had spent colossal resources conquering Scotland, but couldn't achieve complete submission. Every year uprisings flared in new areas, and Scottish nobility wavered between submission and rebellion. Wallace represented a special threat because he wasn't an aristocrat. Feudal uprisings could be suppressed by buying vassals' loyalty or arranging profitable marriages. But Wallace relied on support from common people, peasants, craftsmen, minor knights, who couldn't be bought or intimidated by traditional methods. His execution was meant to be the symbolic murder of all Scottish resistance. But Wallace's last words turned the execution into a propaganda failure. Instead of submissive repentance, English subjects saw a man who, even while dying, refused to recognize their king's authority. His curses were perceived not as blasphemy, but as prophecy. Monk John of Fordun, writing a Scottish chronicle 20 years after the execution, noted, "Wallace's words on the scaffold spread across Scotland faster than any messenger. People repeated them like prayers, and each repetition added to their power. Even if the exact text of his speech was distorted in transmission, the emotional impact remained unchanged." What was most terrible for the English crown was that Wallace didn't seek a martyr's crown. He didn't present himself as an innocent victim of tyranny. He openly acknowledged his hatred and thirst for revenge. This made him a far more dangerous symbol than any Christian martyr, because his example justified violence rather than calling for patience. A year after Wallace's execution, English officials in Scotland began reporting to the king about a strange phenomenon. Throughout the country, people appeared calling themselves Wallace's Avengers and conducting daring attacks on English garrisons. They didn't simply kill enemies, they tried to repeat elements of the execution, quartering English soldiers' bodies and hanging parts from trees. The story of Wallace's last words shows how thin the line is between power's triumph and its defeat. King Edward wanted to demonstrate the price of resistance, but instead created a symbol that outlived both himself and his kingdom. The Scotsman's last words proved more terrible than his sword because they touched the most vulnerable spot of any power, its claims to legitimacy. 700 years after Wallace's execution, historians still debate what exactly he said in his final minutes. But the very existence of these disputes reveals something more important than, quote, accuracy, the mechanism of transforming a man into legend and a weapon of political propaganda. The main problem with sources about Wallace's last words lies in their origin. Practically all written testimonies were created by people who had direct interest in certain interpretations of events. English chroniclers wanted to present the Scotsman as a bloodthirsty fanatic, Scottish ones as a martyr for faith and freedom. The Lanercost Chronicle, written by English monks, claims Wallace blasphemed and cursed until death. The Chronicle of Barber, created at the Scottish court, describes him as a hero who prayed for his homeland's salvation. Both versions were created by people who weren't present at the execution, but knew what version their patrons expected. Professor of Medieval History Michael Brown from the University of St. Andrews explains this situation simply. In the 14th century, history was written not to establish truth, but to justify politics. Each chronicler knew his work would be read at court and chose facts and interpretations accordingly. The situation with oral traditions is even more complex. In medieval Scotland, most of the population was illiterate, and information was transmitted through ballads and folk songs. These works changed with each retelling, adapting to audience expectations and the moment's political circumstances. Folklore researcher David Seller analyzed Scottish ballads about Wallace and discovered an interesting pattern. In songs recorded in areas that supported English rule, Wallace is portrayed as a cruel bandit. In regions where anti-English sentiments persisted, he's presented as a holy warrior. Modern science offers several methods for working with such contradictory sources. First, searching for details that coincide in all versions regardless of their political orientation. Second, analyzing what sources conceal, since silenced facts are often more reliable than declared ones. Applying these methods to the story of Wallace's last words, historians reach several conclusions. All sources agree that he spoke during execution. This was unusual for people undergoing such procedures. All sources also confirm that his words made a strong impression on spectators. Dr. Susan McCorkindale from the Institute of Medieval Studies at the University of Edinburgh suggests the key to solving this lies in understanding extreme stress physiology. A person in agony can demonstrate remarkable clarity of consciousness, she explains. This is a brain defense mechanism that mobilizes all the body's resources when facing imminent death. Psychological studies of people who survived clinical death show an interesting pattern. Many describe a state of extraordinary mental clarity and emotional detachment at critical moments. Perhaps Wallace really did speak coherently and impressively, but the content of his speech was interpreted by witnesses according to their own beliefs and fears. Analysis of legal documents from that time shows Wallace's execution procedure was carefully planned as a propaganda event. Edward I personally approved the guest list, which included representatives of Scottish nobility, English lords, high church hierarchs, and foreign diplomats. Each group of spectators was meant to take a specific lesson from what they saw. Scots, fear of English justice; English, confidence in their king's strength; churchmen, confirmation of divine wrath against rebels; diplomats, a warning to their sovereigns about the price of resisting English will. But political theater has one peculiarity. It can produce results opposite to those intended. Historian Richard Ogg from Cambridge University calls Wallace's execution a classic example of propaganda miscalculation. Instead of demonstrating power's strength, it showed its insecurity and cruelty. The most striking evidence of the execution's effect was the English aristocracy's reaction. Letters survive from lords who attended the execution, describing their impressions. Most note not justice's triumph, but feelings of awkwardness and shame for what they witnessed. The Earl of Warwick wrote to his friend, "Saw the Scotsman's death today, and cannot rid myself of the thought that we killed a man nobler than many of us." This letter is particularly important, since Warwick was one of the main supporters of harsh policy toward Scotland. The common people's reaction proved even more unexpected. Instead of satisfaction at an enemy's punishment, London chroniclers note the crowd's strange silence after the execution. Usually public executions ended with revelry and drinking, but in Wallace's case, people dispersed quietly. Within days of the execution, rumors of ill omens began spreading through London. People reported strange dreams, unusual animal behavior, and ghost appearances. City authorities were forced to issue a special decree forbidding the spread of false prophecies and superstitious talk. The execution's political consequences manifested very quickly. Within a month, Edward's intelligence reported new uprising centers in Scotland. People who had previously accepted English dominance began joining rebels. Wallace's name became the insurgents' battle cry. The most important result was that the execution united scattered Scottish opposition around a single idea. Previously, uprisings were local in nature and often suppressed by forces loyal to the English crown. After Wallace's execution, resistance acquired a nationwide character. Robert the Bruce, Scotland's future king, was still wavering between loyalty to Edward and supporting independence at that moment. Witnesses claim that news of Wallace's last words finally swayed him toward rebellion. 6 months later, he was crowned King of Scotland and began a war that ended in the country's complete independence. The story of Wallace's last words became a classic example of how authorities' attempts to control information can lead to opposite results. The more English authorities tried to present the Scotsman as a villain, the more heroic he appeared in his compatriots' eyes. 720 years after William Wallace's execution, we still don't know exactly what he said in his final minutes. But perhaps that's not the main thing. It's far more important to understand how his death transformed from a triumph of English justice into a symbol of the human spirit's invincibility. The real tragedy of Wallace's execution lies not in the procedure's cruelty, but in its complete senselessness from the standpoint of stated goals. King Edward wanted to intimidate the Scots and demonstrate the price of resistance. Instead, he created a martyr whose name became the banner of a liberation war. Modern propaganda researchers find in this story a classic example of what's called the martyr effect. When power applies excessive cruelty against a symbolic figure, it unwittingly gives that figure additional significance. Wallace's death made him more influential than he had been in life. Political science professor James Scott from Yale University explains this phenomenon through the lens of hidden transcripts of power. In any society, two levels of discourse exist: official, controlled by power, and unofficial, where people express their true feelings. Wallace's execution destroyed the boundary between these levels. What English authorities presented as just punishment of a traitor, Scots interpreted as a hero's murder. The more official propaganda demonized Wallace, the more popular rumor heroized him. As a result, power lost control of the narrative. Analysis of documents from that time shows English administration in Scotland quickly understood their mistake. Already a year after the execution, officials received instructions not to mention the name of the traitor, Wallace, in official documents. But it was too late. His name had already become part of Scottish national consciousness. The psychological impact of the story about Wallace's last words was particularly strong because it appealed to basic human emotions. Regardless of political views, people could imagine themselves in the place of a man who refused to break even facing agonizing death. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman from Harvard University's Institute of Psychology studied the influence of historical narratives on national identity. Her research shows that stories of heroic resistance to authority have special emotional power because most people feel powerless to some degree when facing control systems. Wallace's story became archetypal not only for Scotland. Similar narratives about heroes who chose death over capitulation can be found in the folklore of practically all peoples. American colonists remembered Wallace during the War for Independence, Irish rebels during the struggle against English dominance, participants in anti-colonial movements worldwide. Modern neuroscience explains this universality through the concept of neural mirrors. When we hear a story about a person experiencing extreme circumstances, our brain automatically models these experiences, creating an empathetic connection with the hero. The brighter and more emotional the story, the stronger this connection. The transformation of Wallace's image in the popular culture shows how historical facts adapt to each era's needs. In the 18th century, he was presented as a fighter against tyranny. In the 19th, as a defender of national independence. In the 20th, as a symbol of resistance to fascism. The film Braveheart created a new image of Wallace for the globalization era, a universal hero fighting for freedom against a faceless system. The historical inaccuracy of this image didn't diminish its emotional impact. On the contrary, simplification made the story more accessible to international audiences. The paradox is that the further we move from the real events of the 14th century, the more Wallace's influence grows. His name has become a brand symbolizing resistance to injustice. Scotland's tourism industry earns millions of pounds from places connected to his name. But Wallace's most important legacy is not economic but psychological. His story proves that power has limits, that the human spirit can prove stronger than any coercion. In a world where most people feel powerless facing large systems, this idea remains revolutionary. Wallace's last words, whatever they actually were, became a symbol that some things are more precious than life. In an era when cynicism and pragmatism often defeat idealism, this story reminds us of the existence of people ready to die for their beliefs. Perhaps this is exactly why we continue arguing about what the Scottish knight said before death 700 years ago. Not because it's important for understanding medieval history, but because it's important for understanding who we want to be ourselves. In the end, Wallace's most terrible words aren't the curses he might have uttered on the scaffold, but the question his story poses to each of us. What are you prepared to do for what you sincerely believe? Share in the comments. Which historical figures inspire you to resist injustice? Subscribe to the channel to learn more stories about people who changed the world by refusing to stay silent.